Do you dare to be scared? If so, then this video is for you. We're counting down the top 11 ghost stories of all time, based on their popularity, critical acclaim, and overall scariness. From classic tales of terror to modern masterpieces of fright, these stories are sure to send a chill down your spine. So, grab a blanket, dim the lights, and get ready for a night of scares. Number 1. The Bloody Chamber. Once upon a time, there was a book called The Bloody Chamber, written by Angela Carter. It was a collection of short stories, all of them based on fairy tales and folk tales, but with a dark and twisted twist. The stories in The Bloody Chamber were not like the fairy tales that you grew up with. They were not about princesses and dragons and happily ever after. Instead, they were about the dark side of humanity, the things that we are afraid to face, the things that we keep hidden away. In the story, The Bloody Chamber, a young woman marries a wealthy marquis, but soon discovers that he has a dark secret. He is a murderer, and he has killed all of his previous wives. The young woman must now find a way to escape before she becomes his next victim. In the story, The Company of Wolves, a young woman is warned about the dangers of the forest, but she disobeys and goes there anyway. She soon encounters a pack of wolves, but instead of being afraid, she is drawn to them. She begins to transform into a wolf herself, and she realizes that she is one of them. The stories in The Bloody Chamber are not for the faint of heart. They are dark and disturbing, but they are also strangely beautiful. Carter's writing is lyrical and evocative, and she creates a world that is both familiar and alien. One day, a young woman named Alice was walking through the library when she came across The Bloody Chamber. She had never heard of it before, but the title intrigued her. She picked it up and began to read. Alice was immediately drawn into the stories. She was captivated by Carter's writing and the dark and twisted world that she created. She read the stories one by one, and each one left her with a sense of unease. When Alice finished reading the book, she was shaken but also exhilarated. She had never read anything like it before. She realized that The Bloody Chamber was a book that would stay with her for a long time. The next day, Alice was walking through the forest when she came across a path that she had never seen before. She decided to follow it, and soon she found herself in a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a beautiful old castle. Alice was drawn to the castle, and she walked up to the door. She knocked, and a moment later, the door opened. A handsome young man stood there. "Hello," he said. "My name is the Marquis. Would you like to come in?" Alice hesitated for a moment, but then she nodded and stepped inside. The Marquis led Alice through the castle. It was even more beautiful inside than it was outside. The walls were decorated with tapestries and paintings, and the rooms were filled with antique furniture. The Marquis led Alice to a room at the top of the castle. It was a bedroom, and it was decorated in red and black. There was a large bed in the center of the room, and on the bedside table was a ruby necklace. "This is for you," the Marquis said. "Put it on." Alice took the necklace and put it on. It fit perfectly around her neck. "You look beautiful," the Marquis said. Alice smiled. She felt beautiful. The Marquis leaned in and kissed her. Alice closed her eyes and kissed him back. When they broke apart, the Marquis looked into Alice's eyes. "I love you," he said. "Will you marry me?" Alice hesitated for a moment. She didn't know the Marquis very well, but she felt drawn to him. "Yes," she said. "I will marry you." The Marquis smiled. He picked Alice up and carried her to the bed. Alice closed her eyes and waited. She knew that she was about to embark on a dangerous journey, but she was also excited. She knew that she was about to experience something that she would never forget. The Bloody Chamber is a book that will stay with you long after you finish reading it. It is a book that is both dark and beautiful, and it will challenge you to think about the world in new ways. Number 2. The Haunting of Hill House. Hill House stood alone against the hills, its dark windows staring out at the world like empty eyes. It was a house with a reputation, a house that was said to be haunted. Dr. John Montague, an investigator of the supernatural, had invited 3 others to join him in a study of Hill House: Eleanor Vance, a shy young woman who had experienced paranormal phenomena in the past; Theodora, a bohemian artist; and Luke Sanderson, the young heir to Hill House. At first, the four of them were skeptical. They spent their days exploring the house and its grounds, looking for evidence of the supernatural. But as the days turned into weeks, the strange occurrences began. Doors would open and close on their own. Objects would move across rooms without anyone touching them. Whispers and footsteps could be heard in empty hallways. Eleanor was the one who was affected the most by the house. She became increasingly withdrawn and paranoid. She began to see visions of a woman in white and to hear voices calling her name. One night, Eleanor was awakened by a pounding at her door. She opened it to find a figure standing there, shrouded in darkness. The figure reached out to her and whispered her name. Eleanor screamed and ran back into her room. She slammed the door shut and locked it. But the pounding continued. The next morning, Eleanor was found dead in her bed. Her face was frozen in a mask of terror. Dr. Montague and the others were devastated. They didn't know what to do. They decided to leave Hill House, but as they were packing their belongings, they heard a noise. They turned to see the door to the library slowly opening. A figure stood in the doorway, dressed in white. It was the same woman that Eleanor had seen. The woman raised her hand and pointed at Dr. Montague. "You will stay," she said. Dr. Montague and the others were paralyzed with fear. They watched as the woman turned and walked back into the library. The door closed behind her, and they were alone. Dr. Montague and the others never left Hill House. They became trapped there, forever haunted by the spirits of the house. Epilogue. Years later, a group of tourists visited Hill House. They had heard the stories about the house, but they didn't believe them. They spent the day exploring the house, laughing and talking. But as the sun began to set, they started to feel uneasy. They heard strange noises and saw shadows moving out of the corner of their eyes. One by one, the tourists disappeared. Some of them were found dead, their faces frozen in masks of terror. Others were never seen again. Hill House still stands alone against the hills, its dark windows staring out at the world like empty eyes. It is a house with a reputation, a house that is said to be haunted. Number 3. The Exorcist. It began with a strange noise. A low, guttural growling that seemed to come from nowhere. Chris McNeil, a famous actress, was home alone with her 12-year-old daughter, Reagan, when she first heard it. At first, Chris thought it was just the house settling. But the growling persisted, getting louder and more menacing. She went to investigate, but couldn't find anything. Soon, Reagan started to exhibit strange behavior. She would talk in a deep, raspy voice, and her eyes would roll back in her head. She would levitate off her bed, and her body would contort into impossible positions. Chris was terrified. She didn't know what was happening to her daughter. She took Reagan to see doctors and psychiatrists, but no one could help her. Finally, Chris turned to the Catholic Church. She contacted Father Damien Karras, a Jesuit priest and psychiatrist who had a reputation for helping people with demonic possession. Karras was reluctant to believe that Reagan was possessed, but he agreed to see her. He was shocked by what he found. Reagan was clearly possessed by a powerful demon. She spoke in Latin and ancient tongues, and she had superhuman strength. She was also incredibly intelligent, and she knew everything about Karras's past and his deepest fears. Karras knew that he needed help. He contacted Father Lancaster Marin, an elderly priest who was an expert in exorcism. Together, Karras and Marin performed the rite of exorcism on Reagan. It was a long and grueling process, but in the end, they were successful. The demon was cast out, and Reagan was freed. The Exorcist is a terrifying story about the power of faith and the resilience of the human spirit. It is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of evil. Reagan McNeil grew up to be a normal, healthy woman. She never spoke about her experience as a possessed child, but she did become a devout Catholic. Father Damien Karras was deeply affected by his experience with Reagan. He continued to work as a psychiatrist, but he also became a leading expert on exorcism. Father Lancaster Marin died shortly after the exorcism, but his legacy continues. He is remembered as one of the greatest exorcists of all time. The Exorcist remains one of the most popular and influential horror novels ever written. It has been adapted into a successful film series, and it continues to be read and enjoyed by people all over the world. Number 4. The Little Hands. The Little Hands were a mystery. They appeared and vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of cold chills and unanswered questions. They were first felt by patented Spacehook's mother, all those years ago, when she played the piano in the haunted house. They brushed against her ankles, clasped her legs tightly, and then disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. Patented Spacehook's mother wasn't the only one to encounter the Little Hands. Other people who visited the house reported similar experiences. Some felt their ankles tickled, while others felt their hands being squeezed. A few even claimed to have seen the Little Hands floating in the air. The Little Hands were always associated with the piano. It was as if they were drawn to the music, or perhaps to the spirit of the little girl who had died so tragically. One day, a group of paranormal investigators decided to visit the house. They set up cameras and recording equipment, hoping to capture evidence of the Little Hands. That night, the investigators sat in the living room, listening to the silence. Suddenly, one of the cameras picked up a movement at the foot of the piano. A pair of small, translucent hands appeared and began to tickle the investigators' ankles. The investigators were stunned. They had never seen anything like it before. They tried to communicate with the Little Hands, but they didn't respond. They simply disappeared as suddenly as they had appeared. The investigators left the house that night, baffled but intrigued. They had no explanation for what they had seen, but they knew one thing for sure: the Little Hands were real. The Little Hands remain a mystery to this day. Some people believe that they are the spirit of the little girl who died in the house. Others believe that they are something else entirely, perhaps a portal to another dimension. Whatever they are, the Little Hands are a reminder that there are things in this world that we can't explain. They are a reminder that there is more to this world than meets the eye. And they are a reminder that even in the most ordinary places, there can be a touch of magic. Number 5. The Haunted Ambulance. Zerbo had heard the stories about Rig 12, the haunted ambulance, but he didn't believe in ghosts. Not until he had his own experience with it. It was 3 a.m., and Zerbo and his partner were working in a rural community. It was pitch dark and completely quiet. They were both dozing in the ambulance, Zerbo in the driver's seat and his partner in the passenger seat. Zerbo woke up to a muffled voice. He thought it was his partner talking, so he told her to go back to sleep. But then he heard the voice again. "Oh my God, am I dying?" The voice was male, and it sounded like it was coming from the patient compartment in the back of the ambulance. Zerbo and his partner sat up straight and looked back. Everything was quiet. Then they heard the click of an oxygen bottle regulator and a hiss. "What was that?" Zerbo's partner asked. "I don't know," Zerbo said, "but I don't like it." Zerbo turned on the lights in the ambulance, and they both ran out to check the back. The rear doors were still closed, and there was no one inside. "What the hell?" Zerbo said. He checked the oxygen bottles. None of them were leaking. "Maybe it was just the wind," his partner said. But Zerbo knew what he had heard. It was a man's voice, and it had sounded like he was in pain. They got back in the ambulance and tried to sleep, but neither of them could. They kept hearing strange noises and feeling cold spots. The next day, they told the other EMTs about their experience. Everyone had heard stories about Rig 12, but no one had ever had anything like this happen to them before. Zerbo and his partner never worked on Rig 12 again. They both agreed that it was haunted. Epilogue. A few months later, Zerbo heard that another crew had had a similar experience with Rig 12. They were driving down a deserted road when they saw a man standing in the middle of the road. They pulled over to check on him, but when they got out of the ambulance, the man was gone. Zerbo believes that the ghost of the man who died in Rig 12 is still haunting the ambulance. He warns other EMTs to be careful when they work on it. Number 6. The Impish Ghost. Once upon a time, there was a playful poltergeist named Billy. He lived in an old house with 2 neighbors, Diane and Abby. Billy was a mischievous ghost, but he was also kind-hearted. He loved to play pranks on Diane and Abby, but he never meant any harm. One day, Abby came home from work and found her milk carton in the cupboard. She laughed and said, "Billy, you're such a prankster." Then she put the milk back in the fridge and went about her day. Later that evening, Diane called Abby. "Billy's been at it again," she said. "I can't find my gallon of milk anywhere." Abby sighed. "I'm not surprised," she said. "He put my milk in the cupboard earlier today." "Did he find yours?" Diane asked. "Not yet," Abby said, "but I'm sure he will." A few minutes later, Abby heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find Diane standing there, holding a gallon of milk. "I found it," Diane said. "It was outside on my back steps." Abby laughed. "That's Billy for you," she said. Another day, Abby woke up to find her sugar bowl empty. She sighed and said, "Billy, you're always stealing my sugar." Then she went to the pantry to get a new bag of sugar. When she opened the pantry door, she was surprised to see that all of the food had been rearranged. The cereal boxes were stacked on the floor, the canned goods were piled on top of each other, and the milk cartons were scattered everywhere. Abby laughed. "Billy, you're such a troublemaker," she said. Then she started to clean up the pantry. As she was putting the food back in its place, she found a note tucked under a bag of chips. "Sorry for the mess," the note said. "I just couldn't resist. Love, Billy." Abby smiled and put the note in her pocket. She knew that Billy was just trying to have fun. Diane and Abby lived with Billy for many years. He continued to play pranks on them, but they never got tired of him. They knew that he was a special ghost, and they were lucky to have him as a friend. One day, Diane and Abby decided to move to new homes. They were sad to leave Billy behind, but they knew that he would always be with them in their hearts. On the day of their move, Diane and Abby went to say goodbye to Billy. They stood in the old house and called out his name. "Billy?" Diane said. "Are you there?" A few seconds later, a breeze blew through the house. Diane and Abby smiled. They knew that Billy was saying goodbye. "Thank you for everything, Billy," Abby said. "We'll miss you." Diane and Abby left the old house and started their new lives. But they never forgot Billy, the playful poltergeist who brought so much joy into their lives. Number 7. The Irie Attic. A few years ago, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Melbourne, Australia. It was my first time living on my own. The apartment block was built in the 1930s. A few months later, I came home from work and saw that a wooden board covering a hole in the ceiling to the attic was broken in two on the ground. I emailed the landlord, and she said that her last two tenants had also reported the same thing happening. She promised to replace the board, and she did. A month later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a dragging sound coming from above my bed. I froze, convinced that someone was up in the attic. There is no way an animal could make that sound. After 5 minutes, I worked up the courage to turn on the light and arm myself with a cricket bat. I walked to the bathroom, but the board covering the hole was broken in two again. I heard whispering coming from the attic. It sounded like children's voices, and I could hear one sentence repeated over and over. "It's your turn. It's your turn." I switched on every light in the apartment and watched TV to try to unwind. Then a fuse blew. My pet budgie, Dexter, started squawking like he was being strangled. I'd never heard him make those sorts of noises before. I grabbed my car keys and ran out, sitting in my car until the sun came up. When I went back in the apartment, the front door was open, but I figured I might have forgotten to close it when I ran out. I went to the kitchen to check on Dexter, but he wasn't in his cage. All my windows were closed, so I looked everywhere inside. When I walked to the bathroom, I heard splashing. Dexter was half drowned in the toilet. I took him out, washed him, and dried him. I was so confused. At 8 a.m., I called the landlord and gave her a watered-down version of the night. "Oh, wow, you heard the whispering too," she said. I stayed in that apartment for another 18 months. I heard the whispering on a few occasions, and twice the board covering the hole in the ceiling moved. Although I live elsewhere now, the landlord recently called. She said that her new tenants had begged to speak with me about some of the stuff that's been going on there. I told her to forget it. It's their problem now. Number 8. The Boy with No Eyes. On a quiet street in a small town, there lived a boy named Billy. Billy was a happy and carefree child until one night he had a terrifying encounter. Billy was woken up by the sound of his bedroom door opening. He sat up in bed, expecting to see his parents, but instead, he saw a boy with no eyes. The boy was standing at the foot of Billy's bed, holding a small box in his hand. Billy was terrified, but he couldn't take his eyes off of the boy. The boy extended his hand, offering the box to Billy. Hesitantly, Billy reached out and took it. The box was warm to the touch, and it pulsed with a strange energy. Billy opened the box, and inside, he saw a single eye. The eye was bloodshot and veiny, and it looked as if it was still alive. Billy recoiled in horror, and the box fell out of his hand. As soon as the box fell, the boy with no eyes disappeared. Billy looked around his room, but he was alone. He tried to convince himself that it was just a dream, but he knew that what he had seen was real. From that night on, Billy was haunted by the boy with no eyes. He would see him in his dreams, and sometimes even in the waking world. The boy would always be standing in the shadows, watching him with his empty sockets. Billy's parents were worried about him. He had become withdrawn and fearful. He didn't want to play with his friends anymore, and he was always looking over his shoulder. One day, Billy's mother took him to see a doctor. The doctor told Billy that he was just going through a phase and that he would get over it in time. But Billy knew that it wasn't that simple. Billy's nightmares grew worse and worse. He would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat. He was so tired that he could barely function during the day. One night, Billy had the worst nightmare of his life. He dreamed that he was being chased by the boy with no eyes. The boy was gaining on him, and Billy could feel the boy's cold breath on his neck. Billy woke up with a start. He was sitting in his bed, but he could still feel the boy's presence. He looked up at the ceiling, and there was the boy with no eyes, staring down at him. The boy opened his mouth and spoke. His voice was raspy and hollow. "Give me back my eye," he said. Billy screamed. He covered his eyes with his hands, but it was too late. The boy with no eyes reached out and took Billy's eyes. Billy was left blind, but he was finally free from the boy with no eyes. He never saw the boy again, but he never forgot him. Billy grew up to be a strong and independent man. He learned to live without sight, and he never let his disability stop him from achieving his goals. But he always carried with him the memory of the boy with no eyes and the terrifying nightmare that changed his life forever. Number 9. The Red Lady of Huntington College. The Red Lady of Huntington College is one of the most famous ghosts in Alabama. She is said to haunt the former Pratt Hall dormitory, which was built in 1912. The legend of the Red Lady dates back to the early 20th century, when the college was still known as the Women's College of Alabama. According to the legend, the Red Lady was a young woman named Martha who came to Huntington from New York to pursue her education. However, Martha struggled to fit in at the college. She was homesick and lonely, and she found it difficult to make friends. One day, Martha became so overwhelmed by her sadness that she took her own life in her room in Pratt Hall. After Martha's death, her ghost began to be seen by other students and faculty. She is described as a young woman with long, flowing red hair and wearing a red dress. She is often seen walking the hallways of Pratt Hall or sitting in her old room. There have been many reports of sightings of the Red Lady over the years. Some students have said that they have seen her standing outside their windows at night. Others have said that they have heard her footsteps in the hallways or felt her presence in their rooms. One of the most common stories about the Red Lady is that she appears on the anniversary of her death. On this night, a red light is said to glow from her room window. Some people have even claimed to have seen her apparition standing in the window, looking out at the campus. The Red Lady has become a legend at Huntington College. Her story is told to new students every year, and she is often featured in articles and books about haunted places. The Red Lady is a reminder of the college's long history, and she adds a touch of mystery and intrigue to the campus. Here is a short story about a student who encounters the Red Lady. Sarah was a new student at Huntington College. She had just moved to Montgomery from a small town in Alabama, and she was excited to start her new life. On her first night at the college, Sarah and her roommate, Emily, decided to explore the campus. They walked through the quad, admiring the old oak trees and the historic buildings. When they came to Pratt Hall, Sarah stopped and looked up at the imposing brick building. "I heard that this is the most haunted building on campus," Sarah said. "Yeah, I've heard that too," Emily replied. "They say that the ghost of a young woman haunts the 4th floor. Do you believe in ghosts?" Sarah asked. "I don't know," Emily said. "I've never seen one, but I've heard a lot of stories." Sarah and Emily decided to go inside Pratt Hall. They walked up the stairs to the 4th floor and explored the empty hallways. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she walked through the old building. Suddenly, Sarah heard a noise behind her. She turned around and saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a young woman with long, flowing red hair. She was wearing a red dress. Sarah gasped in surprise. The young woman smiled at her and then turned and disappeared into thin air. Sarah stood there for a moment, stunned. She had just seen the ghost of the Red Lady. Sarah ran back down the stairs and told Emily what had happened. Emily was skeptical at first, but Sarah was sure of what she had seen. Sarah and Emily never forgot what happened that night. They never saw the Red Lady again, but they knew that she was real. The Red Lady remains a mystery to this day. No one knows for sure why she haunts Pratt Hall or what she wants. But her story is one that will continue to be told at Huntington College for generations to come. Number 10. The Ghost of Frederick Jordan. On a cold, December night in 1916, Frederick Jordan, the lighthouse keeper of Penfield Reef Lighthouse in Connecticut, set out on a perilous journey. A series of storms had stranded him at the lighthouse for weeks, and he longed to see his family for Christmas. But the seas were treacherous, and Jordan knew the risks. He climbed into his dory and began to row towards shore. The waves crashed against the boat, and the wind whipped in his face. But Jordan was a skilled mariner, and he was determined to make it home. As he neared the shore, a sudden gale-force wind capsized his boat. Jordan was thrown into the icy water. He struggled to swim, but the waves were too strong. He was swept away by the current and drowned. Jordan's body was never recovered, but his spirit is said to remain at Penfield Reef Lighthouse to this day. Over the years, there have been numerous reports of strange occurrences at the lighthouse. Visitors have seen a ghostly figure standing on the tower, waving his lantern. Others have heard footsteps echoing through the empty halls, and some have even felt a cold chill run down their spines as they pass through certain rooms. One of the most famous stories of the ghost of Frederick Jordan is that of a young Coast Guard officer named Rudolph Iton. Iton was assigned to Penfield Reef Lighthouse in the early 1900s. One night, he was awakened by a strange sound. He got up and went to investigate. In the hallway, he saw a hazy figure coming towards him. The figure was wearing a lighthouse keeper's uniform, and it was carrying a lantern. As the figure drew closer, Iton could see that it was the ghost of Frederick Jordan. Jordan stopped in front of Iton and smiled. He spoke in a low voice, saying, "Thank you for taking care of my lighthouse." Then he turned and walked away. Iton was shaken by the experience, but he was also honored to have met the ghost of Frederick Jordan. He knew that Jordan was a good man, and he was determined to uphold the lighthouse keeper's legacy. To this day, the ghost of Frederick Jordan is said to watch over Penfield Reef Lighthouse. He is a reminder of the sacrifices that lighthouse keepers have made to keep mariners safe. One night in 2023, a group of paranormal investigators visited Penfield Reef Lighthouse. They were determined to capture evidence of the ghost of Frederick Jordan. The investigators set up their equipment throughout the lighthouse. They used cameras, motion sensors, and EMF detectors to monitor for any unusual activity. As the night went on, the investigators began to experience strange things. They heard footsteps in empty rooms, and they felt cold spots. One of the investigators even saw a shadowy figure moving out of the corner of her eye. But the most convincing piece of evidence came from the EMF detector. The detector began to beep wildly when the investigators entered the lighthouse tower. This indicated that there was a strong electromagnetic field in the area. The investigators believed that the EMF detector was picking up the energy of Frederick Jordan's ghost. They believe that he is still drawn to the lighthouse and that he is watching over the mariners who sail past. The ghost of Frederick Jordan is a reminder that even in death, some people remain dedicated to their work. He is a symbol of the courage and sacrifice of lighthouse keepers everywhere.